Welcome. This is Subin Cho of the IRIPIC, the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of World Heritage Sites under the auspices of UNESCO. A great pleasure to meet you all at the 2022 WIPIC Online Lecture and Webinar Series. Starting from 25th August, WIPIC is holding the online lecture and webinar series in cooperation with African World Heritage Fund and Our World Heritage. There are 5 sessions of lectures and webinars prepared under the theme Bridging the Gap 50 Years of the World Heritage Convention. We hope we can look through the history of World Heritage and talk about the future with World Heritage. Every event is open to all without any pre-register, and the recorded videos will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. Each session has a time for Q&A with the general public participants' questions. Therefore, don't forget to leave your opinions and questions about today's topic and World Heritage issues in comments of the live streaming video, as we have time for questions after the lecture. Now, I would like to introduce today's lecturer. Today's lecturer, Mr. James Carter, has over 30 years' experience of developing interpretation projects and of running training events for people from national parks, museums, and nature reserves and historic sites. He is a fellow of the Association of Heritage Interpretation, which is also known as AHI, the UK's national body for the profession. In 2015, the AHI gave him its first Lifetime Achievement Award for his contribution to developing group practice in the field. He has worked with natural and cultural World Heritage sites in Scotland, Sweden, France, Ireland, and Norway. James Carter sees interpretation as a vital part of site design and management. He is particularly interested in projects that take a creative, imaginative approach to helping people find meaning in heritage sites. He recently retired from full-time work as an independent consultant and finds that seeing interpretation more as a consumer is both enjoyable and thought-provoking. So, based on his experience today, he will have a lecture on for sustainable heritage interpretation, public-friendly presentation. A great pleasure to meet you today, Professor.
Thank you, Sabine. I'm not a professor, I should say, but good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are, or when you choose to watch this recording. I'd like to begin by saying thank you to the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of World Heritage Sites for the invitation to take part in this exciting program of lectures and webinars. I'm very pleased to be part of it, and I'm grateful to all the Center staff who have worked so hard to pull this program together. Sabine said a little bit about my background, but I'd like to just say a little bit more about that and what I think it's meant for my approach to interpretation. My career has been focused on practice rather than theory, working on developing exhibitions, site-based installations, and developing interpretation plans alongside site managers who have to deal with the day-to-day reality of welcoming visitors. I've also run a lot of training events, working with people to explore and understand this fascinating field. And I think I've actually learned an awful lot about it from doing training. My views on interpretation have evolved from all of that. At the beginning of my career, I saw it, perhaps rather naively, as a process of communicating ideas and meanings so that people would care about heritage. I've come to see that as perhaps a rather simplistic view. Research shows that people only really care about something when they create their own meanings for it, when they find ways in which heritage connects with their own lives and ideas. So I now believe that interpretation is not so much about communicating meaning, but about offering people ways to make their own meanings from their experience of heritage. Today, I want to look at some aspects of what being public friendly can mean, and to share a model of thinking about visitors that I believe can help us with that. I want to share some examples of interpretation that I think is public friendly and what makes it work. Not all of these examples will be drawn from World Heritage sites, but I believe the lessons from them are applicable anywhere. And I also want to look at an aspect of sustainability that I believe is increasingly important, and it has nothing to do with the carbon footprint of interpretation. I see the concept of being aware of your public and responding to their characteristics as a vital foundation for successful interpretation. I'd go so far, I think, as to say that it's a more important starting point than thinking about what you want to present or how you'll do it. But we need to recognize that the public is a collection of individuals and that they are motivated to visit heritage sites for many different reasons. I'm going to start showing them my presentation now. So as we think about what people want from a heritage visit, visitor research has identified 3 broad areas for the reasons why people come. First of all, people do visit heritage sites because they want to find out about them. They are looking for knowledge about something they believe is interesting or that people have told them is worth knowing about. But that quest for knowledge might be something they want detailed information about or a specific interest, or it might simply be a passing curiosity. Secondly, people are looking for an experience, something satisfying to do in their leisure time. And again, that experience might have different characteristics. They might simply be looking for something fun, something enjoyable. It might be that people want to feel they've had contact with great things, that they have touched things or been in contact with things that are recognized by society as a whole as important. And experience can also be something very personal, with a sense of aesthetic, emotional, or spiritual qualities. And lastly, it's important to recognize that for many people, a heritage site visit is a setting for social interaction. The heritage site is simply a venue to enjoy spending time with friends or family. Now, building on these concepts, I'd like to introduce a model developed by United States author John Falk, which suggests that people's relationship to heritage is a key part of how they build their identity, their sense of themselves. That identity can manifest itself in a number of ways, and I find these ideas useful as a framework for thinking about what interpretation needs to do to help people have a satisfying experience of heritage. Folks' identities begin with explorers, people who are motivated by a curiosity about the world and a desire to discover new things. Facilitators are people who want to share something they see as valuable, important, or pleasurable with their family or with their friends. Experience seekers are motivated by a desire to feel that they have done the highlights, perhaps even ticked off a list of places that they feel they should see during your life. And professionals or hobbyists are people who have a specific interest and want to pursue it, and who may be looking for in-depth and detailed information. And lastly, what John Falk calls rechargers are people who want to feel a deep connection with the place, to drink in its atmosphere, to recharge their sense of identity by a connection with heritage. Let's look at what these identities, as John Falk calls them, might mean for interpretation. I'm going to show you a number of examples of people in heritage sites, which I think exemplify these identities that John Falk described. I find watching what people do in heritage sites fascinating, looking at how they interact with the place and with interpretation. I think we can learn a lot about what makes interpretation work. In this first picture, you'll see my wife, who's exploring the Colosseum in Rome, this huge arena where gladiators fought to entertain vast crowds during the Roman Empire. What I find particularly interesting is her body language. She's been walking around this amazing building, and as she passes this little display of objects, she leans over to see if there's anything in there that will catch her interest. If there is, she'll look at it in more detail and perhaps read some text about it. If nothing catches her attention, she'll move on. I see this as classic explorer behavior, going through a heritage site, open to be engaged by something of interest. So our job as interpreters is to present ideas so that they will engage that casual interest. And that means they need to be attractive and easy to take in. Just before we move on, I'll leave you to consider whether this panel to the right, with a very large amount of text, is going to meet those needs of satisfying a passing interest or not. Another example of something that I think is designed for explorers is this talk being given by a ranger at Muir Woods in California. Muir Woods is a magnificent forest of giant redwood trees, and there is a boardwalk through the forest. At intervals along this boardwalk are small areas like this one that can accommodate a few people at a time, and rangers are there at certain times of day to give short presentations to people who are passing. This particular ranger, I believe her name was Amy, gave a really lively, fascinating talk about the huge trees, and she passed round the tiny seeds from which each one of them has grown, and pieces of bark for people to handle. The talk lasted just about 10 or 15 minutes, after which people were free to continue exploring. Interpretation for facilitators will help them share heritage with their family or friends. Here, my son, he's quite a bit older than this now, but this is him, is with my sister-in-law at a remarkable museum in North Germany. It looks at the history of emigration, and it presents real-life case studies of people who left Germany, looking at the reasons why they left, their experience of the voyage, and what happened to them when they reached the country they were going to. The displays are designed to encourage you to explore those personal stories and to talk about them with your companions, as my sister-in-law is going to do with my son here. Back in the Colosseum is this display, and this I think is far more successful than the text panel we saw earlier. Over on the right here, there is a large illustration showing what the audience in the Colosseum might have looked like during a show, with people sitting on the benches, eating food, playing dice, talking to each other, and so on, much as they might do actually at a modern football game. And down below, there's a cutaway diagram of the Colosseum and how it worked. Now, many groups come to visit the Colosseum, from school children like these to adult guided tours coming on from cruise ships. And every group I saw walking around this space stopped at this panel and the leader used it as a visual aid to talk to their group about the building and its history. So facilitators are looking for things that can prompt a conversation or help them to explain an aspect of heritage to their companions. And again, they need it to be accessible and easily understandable so that it can form a part of their conversation with the people they come with. Moving on to experience seekers. I'm sure we've all seen people doing this at heritage sites. Taking selfies, sharing them on social media has become a central part of people's everyday life, and their visits to heritage are no exception. They might be here on the Palatine Hill in Rome, or they might be here in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, visiting a display about genetics. The sheep that the children are posing with is quite a famous character in Scotland. She was called Dolly, and she was the first mammal to be successfully cloned, a genetically exact copy of another animal. Now, I have no idea how much this little group of the two children and their mother or companion, I have no idea how much they read about the process of genetic cloning or how much they knew before their visit. But having their photo taken with Dolly is clearly an important part of their experience. I think it's easy to consider this experience seeker behavior, taking photographs as a way of saying, I was here, as somehow less worthy or less important than what explorers or facilitators do by engaging with the stories of the place. But I think that would be a mistake. We need to recognize that this behavior is meaningful to many, many people. Interpretation needs to respect that and to cater for it. And I'll come back to that idea briefly a little later in the talk. What John Falk terms rechargers are people who are looking for what I described as an aesthetic, emotional, or spiritual connection with heritage. This is my wife again, although many years before I met her, and she's sitting in a forest of bluebells. And that's all she's doing, sitting among the trees and the flowers, and that is deeply satisfying for her. We need to allow people space for this sort of experience of heritage. She would not have welcomed a ranger coming up offering to talk to her about the flowers, or a panel explaining the ecology of the forest. The same can be true at historic sites or museums. This photograph is in Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, which I think is probably one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever been in my life. It began life as an Orthodox Christian church. It became a mosque, was classified as a museum, and is now, controversially, a mosque again. This photograph was taken some years ago when it was a museum. The man in the picture is lying on the ground so that he can gaze up at the amazing dome that soars over this wonderful space. This is very much recharger behavior, taking a moment just to absorb the experience of being in this place. But notice that balanced on his stomach, he's got a little guidebook. So presumably he's been reading about the building's history. He's also an explorer. And his companion is taking a photograph, which they'll probably share with their friends and use as a reminder of this visit. They are also experience seekers. Lastly, there's the category of hobbyists or professionals. At this historic house in Scotland, there's a display about how the decoration of a room has evolved over time showing layers and layers of wallpaper that have been added to over the centuries. Now, I have to admit that although I find interior design enjoyable, I felt this display was too detailed for me to be interesting. But for wallpaper enthusiasts, and they do exist, it could be fascinating. So we've got these various ways, these various things that people are looking for in their engagement with heritage. And I want to emphasize that these are not fixed roles or personalities. We've seen how somebody can be a recharger and also an explorer and an experience seeker. People often move between building different aspects of their identity during a single visit. At other times, one identity might be dominant. I'd like to invite you to think about whether you recognize these ways of engaging with heritage in your own experience. And lastly, I think it's useful to consider what proportion of time people spend in these different identities. As interpreters and site managers, we're keen to share what we know about a place and what we feel is important. And it's tempting to feel that there are a lot of professionals or hobbyists out there who share our enthusiasm. But the reality is that the key markets for interpretation are explorers and facilitators, that we need to create some space for rechargers and allow experience seekers to do their thing. Professionals and hobbyists are a very small minority. We need to cater for them, but this is best done through special events such as behind-the-scenes tours or talks by experts. Exhibitions designed to satisfy hobbyists and professionals will be too detailed for explorers and facilitators, and probably irrelevant to rechargers and experience seekers. So with this background, I'd like to offer you some principles that I think define good public-friendly interpretation, and to show you some examples of how these principles work in practice. The first principle is that interpretation needs to introduce a few interesting ideas rather than trying to tell people lots of facts. You need to be clear as you're developing interpretation what those ideas are. In interpretation planning, they're called themes, but your visitors will use them as a basis to create their own thoughts and make their own attachments and meanings. In the context of World Heritage, sorry, I skipped one. In the context of World Heritage, it's worth noting that outstanding universal values are just part of the story. They're important, but they're not always the most public-friendly of the ideas we can offer. We need to find ways to link outstanding universal values to human stories, to concepts that people find relevant in their own lives. Secondly, public-friendly interpretation makes it easy for its audience to take in the content or to be involved. Think about the boardwalk we saw in Muir Woods, which people just came across as they were walking through the forest. They didn't need to book in advance to hear the talk that the ranger was giving. If we offer visitors text, audio, or video, it needs to be easy to read, to listen to, or watch. And most importantly, it needs to be brief. Closely related to this is the idea that interpretation needs to present ideas in ways that people can relate to, that connect to their lives and concerns. We saw an example of that at the Emigration Museum in Germany that takes real people's stories as a way of engaging people with the idea of emigration. And lastly, an aspect which I believe is important in thinking about physical installations, such as panels in the landscape or exhibitions. Interpretation needs to be in keeping with the character of the place. for example, by reflecting local materials or colors. It's easier to overlook this, but it's vital, I think, if we are to give people the overriding impression that our heritage is valuable, something worth caring about, and something that has a unique character. Moving on to look at a few examples, I want to start with something apparently quite simple, a panel in the landscape. This is a national nature reserve in the north of Scotland called Ben A, where there's a series of panels around the main car park. This one is set against the view of the mountain across the lake, and it explains how the mountain was formed. Before we look at it in detail, notice how the panel is mounted on a large boulder. It looks almost as if it could be a natural part of the landscape. And also notice how the ground has been paved where people need to walk up to the panel so that they don't wear away the grass and just leave a muddy patch. This is an example of what I mean by the need for physical interpretation to be in keeping with the character of the place and to respond to the way people are going to use it. The panel has a large diagram of the mountain at different points in time and explains how it's formed from two distinct layers of rock, with the top layer having been worn away by glaciers. To the right of the panel, there's a section with two samples of the two different rocks so that you can feel their different textures. I really like the way this panel presents just one simple idea, the way it uses an attractive graphic to catch people's attention and explain the story in visual terms rather than just in words, and the use of these rock samples to engage people's sense of touch as well as sight. And most importantly, I like the fact that the text is brief and written so that it is lively and easy to understand. Another national nature reserve in Scotland is Loch Leven, a large lake near Edinburgh. It's a beautiful place and a popular venue for walking, but it's also an important habitat for birds. There's a small visitor centre on the south shore where many people come to have lunch or coffee, as well as to watch birds. Notice the telescopes in the background of the picture here, which look out over the lake. This cafe is where a lot of the centre's interpretation is placed. And again, the panels just present a few simple stories. This one looks at how the lake is an important feeding ground for birds, a very appropriate idea for a panel which is on the wall of the cafe. This panel looks at how the landscape around the lake has changed and how those changes have not always been good for wildlife. It has the intriguing headline, "Change is good, right?" That question is an invitation to read the content, which is expressed again in brief, lively text. And a third panel has a poem written as if it's the voice of a duck diving for food. The poem was written by a local school student, and I very much like the way the site has involved local people in telling the story of the place. Moving on to an historic site, this is Big Pit in South Wales. It's a former coal mine and part of the Blaenavon Industrial Landscape World Heritage Site, which preserves a lot of mining heritage in the area. At various places in the local area, panels interpret aspects of the industrial landscape. Notice again how they have been designed to fit with that landscape and the stories they tell. They're in big, heavy-looking metal with embossed metal lettering, and the side is decorated with an embossed illustration of a miner. At Big Pit itself, you can take a tour down into the former mine. Because it is still classified as a mine working, you have to wear all the safety equipment that miners would have used. You get kitted out with a safety helmet and a lamp, and the people leading the tours are former miners. The site has worked hard to involve local people in telling the story of their own heritage. Displays in the centre look at aspects of the miners' lives, another example of telling a story through ideas and details that can relate to people's everyday lives. They tell the stories of named individuals, showing the clothes and equipment that miners would have stored in their lockers. In the shower block, where miners washed after their shift, there's even a suggestion that you might meet one of them coming out of the shower. A vital part of this exhibition is that it does not avoid controversial stories. This panel looks at how children were once sent down the mine to work, and it uses quotations from many different sources about working conditions in mines. There's also a very important story about how the mine stopped working. Coal mining came to an end here after the bitter miners' strike in the 1980s, which pitched the Conservative government of the time against miners across the whole of the United Kingdom. This is a story that still has the potential to trigger heated debate and bitter memories. The display explains the background to the strike, and it includes quotations from miners and other people talking about their experience of finishing work. Some of them are glad to leave that life behind, but there's also a sense of regret for a lifestyle that has gone. Just to take one example, this quotation here, "It was a dirty and dangerous job, but I'd go back to it tomorrow." And another one here, giving a completely different aspect, "Before we feel too sorry for the miners, just remember they brought the country to its knees in the 1970s. Where controversial topics like this exist, I think it's important that interpretation addresses them. And I see this as a key part of making interpretation truly sustainable. We need to acknowledge controversy and different perspectives if our heritage is to have real meaning in the future. I was looking at some of the previous webinars that WIPIC has run, and there was one on contested heritage, in which a commentator made the comment that if heritage has multiple stories, but we only present one, that heritage is somehow weakened. And I would agree with that point of view. But as we present different stories, I think we need to do that from a point of view of encouraging tolerance, understanding, and inclusivity, not division. Now, the interpretation at Big Pit is clearly successful. This is just a sample of the sort of reviews the place gets on TripAdvisor. And what I find interesting is that looking at these reviews, people are obviously having a very enjoyable time, but they're also learning things. I found the second review particularly revealing, as it shows how visitors are aware of local people's involvement and pride in their heritage. What an awesome experience. Everyone we spoke to was helpful, willing to listen and answer questions, but most of all, proud of it and interested to explain. Now, to finish with, I'd like to leave you with a question that might challenge what you think of as interpretation. I mentioned that Loch Leven National Nature Reserve has a popular cafe. If you buy a coffee there, it will come with a little design of a bird stenciled on the top in powdered chocolate. Even if you look at none of the exhibition panels, nor look through any of the telescopes, I think this means that you leave with this almost subconscious impression that this place is important for bird life. Back at the Colosseum in Rome, the signs that point the way to facilities like toilets, disabled access, and other parts of the building use designs that include silhouette illustrations of gladiators. Again, if you look at none of the displays, you're getting a subliminal message that this is a place where gladiators fought. And in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, some of the display cases containing jewellery from prehistoric times are built into sculptures by the artist Edoardo Paolozzi. The jewellery is from the Bronze Age and Iron Age, and I find these displays impressive and very evocative, but they have no text. Is this interpretation? I believe it is, and that we need to expand our view of how interpretation can be delivered. Public-friendly interpretation can use many other media than exhibitions, panels, guided tours, leaflets, and multimedia. Visitors make meanings from every aspect of their experience, from the gates of the car park to the decoration of the toilets. I think these sorts of details are particularly important in creating the impression that experience seekers take away. People who will use the heritage site as a setting for taking photographs, making memories, and for social time with friends. This approach means that interpretation extends into many different aspects of how a site is managed. And it means that we may need to involve artists, poets, landscape architects, and performers in the creative process that will shape the impressions and ideas that visitors take away and how they value their heritage. I'd like to thank you for listening and watching. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and reactions or questions. And just before I finish, I'd like to mention that there are a couple of books which I've found particularly helpful in thinking about interpretation. I'll just show them to you now, but the WIPIC team might perhaps add full references to them to the recording of this lecture. One of these is this book, Interpretation: Making a Difference on Purpose, by the American author Sam Hamm. Sam is excellent on the psychological impact of interpretation and how it works. And he's very good at expanding on those principles that I ran through about what makes interpretation work, particularly on the concept of a theme. And if you're involved in writing interpretation for a display, a panel, or perhaps an audio installation, this book, Exhibit Labels by Beverly Sorrell, is the best guide I've come across to how text in exhibitions needs to work and how different it needs to be from text in official reports or academic papers. Thank you once again. Let's hear what questions and comments people may have.
Yes, we have a lot of comments from our public participants today. And beforehand, I would like to thank you for your insightful and inspiring lecture. And I would like to apologize for calling you as a professor, because as I also listened to the lecture carefully with our public participants, so I tend to call our lecturers as professors.
Oh, professor for the day.
Oh yeah, professor for our lectures.
Yeah.
Thank you for your insightful lecture. And yes, I suppose that a lot of our public participants joining today's lecture through our YouTube and Facebook channel are heritage professionals, and of course people who love heritage and culture. And therefore I believe that your lecture, based on your experience, might have been really insightful and also really inspiring for our participants today. So I would like to share some comments before we start our Q&A session today, because there are a lot of comments on our Facebook today, and thanks to Hanan Fayed Najare. And I would like to apologize in case I mispronunciate our participant's name in a wrong way. But thank you, Hanan. And the Hanan Lab said very very interesting ideas of interpretation techniques and tools, and we can all benefit from these ideas. Thank you. And also, Sean Morrissey left that your book recommendations are really nice that by saying required readings for interpreters. Thank you for all the comments on today's lecture, and also thank you for your insightful lecture. And yes, we have a lot of questions today, and I would like to start our Q&A session with this question. So here's our first question. The question is, thank you for sharing your insights. Based on your various experience in this field, what was the most difficult thing for the site managers when developing an interpretation plan?
That's a good question. I think the thing that I've often found people find most difficult is to agree on the themes, the ideas that are going to form the basis for your interpretation. That's a matter, it's like being an editor of a book. You've got a site, almost any site or topic, you could write several books about it. But if you're doing an exhibition or you're developing a program of guided walks, you need to choose just a few key ideas. In interpretation planning, call them themes, and to define them as ideas, not broad subjects like bird life, but definite ideas like the way people manage the land can make life difficult for birds. I'm just plucking an idea out of the air. And I think one of the most challenging things is to get people to recognize, first of all, to recognize that interpretation can only present a few key ideas. And secondly, to agree on what those ideas are and to stick with that throughout the process. I think that's a challenge, but if you can do it, that's key to developing successful public-friendly interpretation.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. Well, we would like to move on to our next question as our participants left a lot of comments and questions. And here's our next question. The question was, often values that heritage companies are not properly recognized by the general public, and this leads to the destruction of places of historic or natural significance. Then what do you think is the role of interpreters in conveying heritage values to audiences?
Right, that's really interesting. I suppose I should say right at the outset that there is some vandalism and destruction that you can never do anything about. I've always said that putting a panel up, for example, in a place that is liable to be vandalized, to be destroyed or spray painted, if that's likely to happen a lot, maybe a panel is not the right thing to use. But I think that in general, I believe that interpretation helps to establish heritage as something of value. I do believe that the quality of the interpretation helps with that. That's why I wanted to emphasize the need for high quality installations and installations that fit with the landscape, that use good materials and recognize local culture. I think that's a part of helping people to associate an idea of value with the place. And I think the last thing I'd say in response to that question is perhaps the more complex response, which is that if heritage is being damaged by groups that are identifiable, we need to try to engage with those groups in some way. We need to work with people who are involved with heritage and may feel that maybe they feel the way it's being used for heritage preservation, maybe they feel threatened by that. We need to work with them. And that can mean that interpretation becomes a lot more about engagement with a community rather than producing things like exhibitions and books and multimedia shows. An engagement with the community, I think, is important. I mentioned that at the mine in Wales, which has worked with local communities, and at the National Nature Reserve at Loch Leven, where school children have written poems. I think activities like that can also be very important in helping to establish heritage as something in which people feel they have a stake and that they will value for themselves.
Thank you for your answer. And if I can add a sentence on your answer, yeah, in case of the natural heritage sites and cultural heritage sites are being destroyed, in most cases, the values and the meanings of heritage and the reason for the conservation or the protection of sites are not fully shared with the general public. So I think that is a role that interpretation must take, which is sharing the values and meanings with the general public. Thank you for your answer. And here's our next question. The question is, now, how would you encourage public-friendly interpretation in sites with stories or narratives that is not agreed upon by related stakeholders, such as communities?
Right, that's a really interesting question, and I wondered whether it might come up because I put some emphasis on this idea of contested stories or controversial stories. I'm tempted to say that I think we can only produce interpretation in some ways can only reflect the discussion that is happening in the community as a whole. And that if the community as a whole is not ready to acknowledge and give space to different stories and narratives, it's going to be very difficult for interpretation to do so. This is an immense topic, and I know you've run a webinar on the whole subject of contested heritage. But I think those stories need to be heard and acknowledged as valid, even if they are very different, before interpretation can present them. The ways that I have seen of presenting controversial or contested narratives that I think work well have often involved simply presenting quotations that convey those different points of view without any sense of judging which of them is right, but simply presenting them saying, these are different points of view, they are all valid, it is up to you to make up your own mind about this. But in presenting those different points of view, you are saying all of these points of view have some validity. I think that was the case at Big Pit in South Wales, where I showed different quotations about coal mining and the miners' strike. I've seen a similar approach taken in the Shetland Isles in the north of Scotland, which was very affected by the oil industry coming in. It made major changes to society. It brought in a lot of wealth and a lot of jobs, but it also changed the society there hugely. And I've seen a very interesting display there that used newspaper headlines, giving contrasting views about the effects of the oil industry on that community. So I'm not sure what else I can say about that. I hope I've given some responses to that question that are useful. it's a process, to use a phrase that is almost a cliche. But I think that the working through of accepting different points of view is something that happens within the community as well as in interpretation.
Thank you for your answer. And yes, there are a lot of still our heritage field professors and professionals and experts still have a lot of still are having a lot of conversation about this issue. And yes, I think as also our last lecturer, Dr. Ishan Lusen Odiawa also shared that there are a lot of stories and a lot of history and many different narratives. So I think we, as she mentioned in her lecture's Q&A session, I think we can just step aside a little bit out from our comfort zone and listen to other stories, just as James mentioned. I think we maybe we don't really have to be that much sensitive about our other stories and other narratives. And yeah, thank you for your answer. And
sorry,
yeah.
Sabine, just one other thought that's just occurred to me on that, which I think it might be worth sharing. This is not based on my own experience, but on a colleague who worked a lot with interpretation in Ireland. And you may be aware that the history between England and Ireland, or the rest of the United Kingdom and Ireland, is not a comfortable one. There were times in the past when the population of Ireland was suffering from desperate famine, desperate hunger. And the British government, this is going back to the 18th, 19th century, made that situation worse. And this colleague of mine who was working with heritage sites in Ireland said that people were very anxious about that. They said, well, we can't tell this story to people coming from England because it's, you know, it's a story in which England did really bad things. And what my colleague said to them was, no, you don't avoid it. You can't avoid that story. It happened. We need somehow to acknowledge it. The people who are coming from England may well be aware of that history. And if you try to avoid it and just pretend it didn't happen, you're cheating them in a way. You need to find a way of talking about that, placing it in the past and seeing what lessons might be learned from it, but not just ignoring it and pretending it didn't happen. Sorry, I moved on from that. The fourth question.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing also the case regarding that, regarding our previous question. And yes, sharing those kind of stories are really meaningful. So thank you for sharing it. And yeah, we have our next question, which is left by Sean Morrish. I'm sorry. The question was, as interpretation has evolved in recent decades, in your view, how important is the work of Freeman Tilden? Personally, I'm still very much inspired by his work, and I'm always curious to hear the thoughts of fellow interpreters. And about this comment, Vivian also left a comment regarding these questions by saying, "Me too, I got new insights whenever we read it."
I agree. I know he wrote his book many, many years ago, but I still find it really inspiring as well. I can even quote by heart, I think, what I think is his most revealing definition of interpretation. At one point in the book, he talks about interpretation being an educational activity, but that's not the sentence that I take inspiration from. At one point, Freeman Tilden says that interpretation is the work of revealing to such visitors as desire the service something of the beauty and wonder the inspirational and spiritual meaning that lie behind what the visitor can, with his senses, perceive. And it's slightly nerdy that I can quote this by heart, but I find that sense of interpretation being about sharing the beauty and spiritual inspiration that lie behind the world that we can interact with through our senses. That I find absolutely inspiring, and it's very much what took me into wanting to work with interpretation. I think a lot of Tilden's writings and the context within which he was working, they're now completely different. And he does have, I think, a bit of an emphasis on what I would describe as a transmit model of communication. Interpreters know something, they transmit it to an audience. And I feel we've moved on a lot from that to what's, in academic terms, it's a more constructivist way of thinking about making meaning. But there's still a lot in Tilden's writing that I think is well worth paying attention to. And as Sean said, and I also feel, inspiring.
Thank you for your answer. Sean Morrissey also left another comment, and by saying that the story is the thing by Freeman Tilden is Sean's favorite Tilden's quote. Thank you for your answer. And yes, as we have quite a lot of questions today and comments, thank you for all our participants. And here's our next question. The question is left on our YouTube, and the question is, I agree, the public-friendly presentation is so much important for sustainable heritage interpretation. However, I think it is also crucial to take the views of various individuals, groups, and communities in presentation and to accept changes according to the passage of time or new evidence. Then, how can institutions such as museums or visitor centers can make an effort to achieve those aspects?
Thank you for that question. I would agree that interpretation needs to move with the times, we might say. It needs to reflect changes in ideas and changes in evidence. We have had some examples in the UK recently. There has been a lot of debate about statues to famous people that were erected, a lot of them in the 19th century or early 20th century. And some of those people made a lot of money from the slave trade. And there's been a lot of debate about how to acknowledge that in the way the statues are presented, or even whether the statues should continue to be in place in the streets. There's an example in Edinburgh where there's a statue of a guy. It's on an immense column in the center of one of the city squares. He was a very important man in his time, a member of the local government. He gave a lot of money to charitable institutions, but he made his money from the slave trade, as a lot of people did at the time. And excuse me, recently, the panel that is next to this column has included some text about how Lord Dundas, that was his name, made his money from the slave trade. So I think we need to be prepared to change our interpretation as new evidence and new ideas evolve and are discussed in society. That's sometimes not so easy. If you're dealing with a single panel, that's relatively easy to replace. If you're dealing with a museum and an entire display, that's not so easy. In that case, I think running programs of events, talks, discussions, public events that look at different ideas, I think they can help to change the way we see things. I think it's also worth remembering that in a museum, it's often difficult to change the way objects are displayed, but changing the captions, changing the labels that go with those objects, that's not so difficult to do. And so that's maybe another way that interpretation can be flexible and reflect changes in different views.
Thank you for your answer. And I think this one may be our last question. And this one is about the book you recommended at the end of your lecture. So the question was left by Marie-Claire Andras. And the question was, thank you for the beautiful presentation. And I would like to ask if we can find the two mentioned books in a PDF form.
I don't know that they are available in PDF form, I'm afraid. I know they are fairly easily available. They're both published in the States. I ordered the exhibit labels one through Amazon. Sam gave me this one because he's a friend. I don't think they are available as PDFs. But if you searched for the authors, Beverly Sorrell and Sam Ham, you might find articles by them. I do have on my website a short guidance note about writing text. It's far less detailed than this, but it does have some key points in it. So there are materials out there that are available in PDFs and for free that would help with those. But those two books, I don't think you can get them as PDF.
Great, thank you for your answer. And we will also leave the title of those books on our social media so that our participants can search for it a little bit more in a more comfortable way. And thank you for your recommendation on books for our heritage professionals too. And once again, I would like to tell you that we are really thankful for your inspiring lecture and also really insightful lecture. And before we end today's event, would you like to leave a comment to our public participants?
Thank you very much for spending time listening to me. I hope you find it interesting. Somebody mentioned that they might have found it inspiring. We've used the word inspiring has been used a few times in the questions and comments. And I think I'd just like to leave you with that. I think heritage is inspiring. I think if we are inspired by it, we can share that through interpretation and hope that other people will be inspired too. So that's the comment I'd leave you with. Go out and inspire people.
Awesome. Awesome for using the inspiring thing too. Thank you. Thank you very much for your insightful lecture today. And well, yeah, I think we may have to end today's event. Thank you for all our public participants' active participation on our event today. And now I would like to briefly introduce our next lecture. The next lecture is Interlinkaging the Tangible and Intangible Memories in Heritage Interpretation with Dr. Neil Kamal Shibagan. The lecture will be held on 20 October 2022 at 14 KST and 6 CT. For further information, please visit WIPIC's website or social media channels. Thanks again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again in our next lecture. Thank you.